Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on how to talk policy and influence people, and I'm here with Fíona Ní Chinnéide from the Irish Penal Reform Trust, a very good friend of mine. Hi Fí, how are you?
Hi Jane, thank you for having me on.
So Fí, I start by asking everyone to just tell me a little bit about themselves and how long you've been with the Irish Penal Reform Trust and that type of thing.
Okay, thanks. So I'm Fíona Ní Chinnéide. I'm the Executive Director of the Irish Penal Reform Trust, a role I will have held for exactly a year tomorrow, and so it has been a very interesting year. I've worked with IPRT though for frightening number of years, 11 years this year. I started as Communications Officer, then Communications Manager, Deputy Director, and now I am the Executive Director. So will I speak about IPRT itself?
Yes, please tell us about IPRT. Obviously, I know what it is because I worked with you and learned so much about policy from you and from the team. But for those who don't know, what is the Irish Penal Reform Trust?
Sure. So the Irish Penal Reform Trust, so we're in existence since 1994, so this is our 26th year. We were originally established by a group of citizens who were concerned about the rights and the treatment of people in prisons. We are a charity and we campaign for progressive policy reform. I think that's an important difference between us and other organisations. We don't follow a service provision model. We do signposting, and of course we answer queries that come our way, but where our theory of change and our model is that if we can affect one good strategic policy change, it will have positive implications for the 4,000 people in prison and for their families and the wider community and all society. Whereas if we had a case management model where we were supporting individual prisoners, with our resources we could perhaps only make things better for maybe 50 people per year. So that's our model.
Okay, and so I was researching policy for a while when you were working in campaigns and communications, and as I say, I learned an awful lot. I had not really known about engaging with the policy making process or how to go about it. Who do you build relationships with? How to write submissions to human rights treaty monitoring bodies and the like. So can you tell me about some of the ways that IPRT engages with the penal policy making process and I suppose the wider criminal justice policy making process?
Sure. And just to acknowledge, Jane, that you and I would have learned side by side in those early years. You know, both of us were learning at that time. And see, like the passion and commitment of everyone who has worked for or volunteers for IPRT is just so intense. It's great, you know, in an area of work that might not enjoy wider public applause, let's say, but it's great. So I'll just talk you briefly maybe about our theory of change, which quite simply is, so we start with, we identify an issue, and we identify that it comes to our attention in a few different ways. It can be from our international research, so if it's happening somewhere else, it's most likely happening in a prison, in our prison system here, or we get communications from either prisoners themselves or their families or people working around them. And as an issue is brought to our attention more often, we think, okay, there might be something here. An example might be, for example, around prisoner transport wasn't on our radar, and then we got communications from different lawyers and people in prison, and then we thought, okay, so there might be an issue here, we need to find out more. And I think this is one thing that IPRT, we are absolutely research and evidence led. You know, we always start with the data. It can be that things come to our attention through anecdotal reports, but we go and find the evidence to demonstrate whether it is true, whether it is in fact, and so it's about informing the questions we ask. Okay, so we think there's an issue. We do our research and evidence to find the basis of that issue, and arising from that, and I think this is where IPRT is one of our strengths, is that we develop solutions, you know. So we don't just raise the issues with all the relevant policy decision makers, we always go with solutions, and these are recommendations that we think you should implement, you know. Like all of our work, I should have said at the beginning, so we're absolutely committed to the promotion and protection of human rights and equality across all areas, but we also recognize that human rights are often minimum standards and that we have to be moving towards best practice. That's particularly important in a small wealthy jurisdiction, which Ireland actually is, you know. So we have our research and our evidence base from which we get our solutions, and then we do what the initial stage is the constructive advocacy. So that's when you ask the key decision makers to consider your proposals, and if not, tell us why not. And that can be through direct engagement, through meetings, or through making submissions. Sometimes those submissions are open processes. So for example, a few years ago, to use the prisoner transport as an example, the Department of Justice had a value for money evaluation of the prison service escort services, you know. So we would make a submission to those processes if they're open, or other times we generate the opportunity to make submissions ourselves. So we call that the constructive level of advocacy. And then if nothing happens, then we move to what we call maybe broader media and engagement, or less constructive advocacy, you know. And that's using just about any lever that's available to you. And sometimes it's media. I mean, media is very useful for raising public awareness and for information, for counteracting, for example, the demonization of offenders, and for humanizing people. So that's the good side, you know. On the other hand, we don't do media engagement just for its own sake. It's not about us as an organization. It's about bringing about positive change. And sometimes the media is very helpful in that regard. But it is not our first port of call. And so other levers that I'm sure we'll talk about in more detail later are things like, so we have the national level, which is engaging. So there are a number of different ways we engage. Sorry, I'm just toppling my tower of papers here.
That's okay.
That's okay? It's loud.
Yeah, okay.
It shows how busy I am. Piles of paper. Yeah. So along with engagement, so another part of our work, which is also policy advocacy, is building capacity in other organizations, because we're tiny, we're only 4 staff, you know. And what we do is sometimes we work in collaboration with other organizations. So for example, on the area of children in detention, or the youth justice system, so we would work very proactively with the Children's Rights Alliance and with membership in that regard, and service organizations. Part of it is building capacity, so we bring all the information we have of the justice system to their work, and also try to raise, for example, our concerns around the children of families of prisoners with those organizations, so that they include them in their more general calls. Other ways we do is that we engage with statutory organizations that have different monitoring obligations. So for example, with the General Ombudsman around prisoner complaints, or with the organ bodies that have specific monitoring in relation to prisons. So for example, the Inspector of Prisons, or with the Visiting Committee. So oftentimes we're also, or another example would be the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, who have a very broad and extremely important mandate in terms of protecting and promoting human rights and equality of everyone in Ireland. And what we would be doing is actively engaging to ensure that people in prison are among their priority issues so far as possible. There are 2 reasons for that. One thing is that these organizations bring an incredible strength and expertise, but also I think fundamentally we are constantly reminding people that people in prison are citizens as well, you know, and that they are not a separate tribe. Yes. They are also us. They're members of our community. They have done harm. They should be held accountable for the harm they have caused, but this must be done in a way that does not cause further harm. So that is another of our objectives, but effectively we're using all those organizations as levers for change as well.
So you mentioned the tininess of IPRT, and I think it's very important to emphasize that despite your tininess, you're highly effective, and that is because of the partnership and strategic approach, you know, the reaching out, the keeping the eyes on the ball for opportunities to influence. When I was there as well, possibly because it was different times and the Irish Prison Service were less open with information, but we used the parliamentary question system a lot, identifying politicians, whether they were senators or TDs, who had an interest in human rights or prisoners, and we would ask them to ask questions. I presume you still do that a bit, and build relationships and try and influence legislation, for example, with spent convictions. I know you were working with Lynn Ruan. Can you maybe say a little bit about engaging directly with politicians?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's a really interesting area of work, and one that has proven very effective. I would say influencing legislation is a very slow process. We've had experiences in the past where we engaged strongly, for example, in the original spent convictions legislation, which then when it returned was it's been described as mean-spirited in its reach, you know. So we engage in legislative processes, but in terms of use of time, sometimes we spend a lot of time and then a bill falls or it doesn't progress. And sometimes we are also intervening to prevent things happening. That's another part of our work, you know. Always with the fundamental goal, we're informed by, you know, the protection, promotion of human rights and equality of people in the penal system. But the other thing is for prison to be a sanction of last resort. Right. So when we see, for example, mandatory sentencing proposals being brought back, very usually knee-jerk reaction to some big and terrible news story or a cluster of terrible events, we would spend a lot of time engaging directly with all members of the Oireachtas in both houses, just trying to prevent, again, always referring back to evidence. You know, I mean, if the research shows that a certain sentencing regime works to reduce crime and bring about the intended effect, fair enough, but most of the time it doesn't, you know. So there's a little bit of preventative work that we do as well. In terms of engaging, so IPRT engages with all parties and all independents, and we share information with anybody who is open to our messaging, and we think that's really important. And we've had a reasonable amount of successes in that regard. It's interesting when you talk about parliamentary questions, because, and also about the information that's provided by the Irish Prison Service now. So, I mean, over the last 10 years, we've gone from a stage of relying on parliamentary questions to know how many people are in prison on a given day, to the Irish Prison Service publishing daily prison numbers per prison, with clearly identifying the numbers on remand, the numbers on temporary release, and although we would question how they judge capacity and what's overcrowding, we might return to that, it has to be acknowledged. They also publish monthly information notes that give you a much clearer picture of who's in prison, the sentence lengths, for example, how many women are serving short sentences who'd be better off in the community. And this is all made public. So that is extremely welcome and a huge move. I mean, we still have challenges. So for example, there's quarterly information published on the number of people in restricted regimes. Very welcome. We still have no sight at all of the length of time that people in Ireland are held in solitary confinement conditions. So we're about halfway there. Yeah. But just to go back to just to acknowledge that has been a big journey and more information is available. But to go back to the policy engagement point, which is the role and purpose of asking parliamentary questions. I mean, so for one thing, it puts something on the public record, and that can be incredibly important. And when something becomes a matter of public record, then you can refer to it with complete authority as being true. We also find that there's a whole awareness raising piece that, which is again why we talk to all parties and members of the Oireachtas of all parties and none, just to put these issues on their radar. So the whole process of asking a politician, maybe in a smaller party, to ask questions about medical health care provision in a prison puts that issue on their radar. The next thing that happens is the information is published, so you've developed a relationship, but beyond that, the media are monitoring all the parliamentary questions. So the media suddenly think they came up with the idea, you know, like a plant. So again, it is putting the issues up on their agenda as well, and demonstrating it to be an issue of importance. And you know, if you think that there are 4,000 people approximately in prison on a given day, and around 8,000 will pass through prisons every year. As a percentage of our overall population, it is small. However, it's a larger number of communities in certain communities. So there's always the argument that there's no votes in prisons, you know, and in prisoners. I mean, we would say yes and no, but the fact is that you can get a more niche or less well-known issue onto agendas by asking parliamentary questions and demonstrating it as an urgent issue. So that's a hugely positive way to go, you know. Also very helpful across departments as well, because even though one struggle, and I would say that it's a struggle that the Department of Justice faces, it's just the silo nature of government departments, and a sort of a general overall lack of interdepartmental and interagency working. Now, within the Department of Justice, we've seen a really strong drive over maybe the last 5 or 8 years towards cross-agency working within the Department of Justice, but there are still big barriers between, for example, Department of Justice and the Department of Health. Mm-hmm. So IPRT would also, through asking questions of the Department of Health, be putting justice issues onto the health agenda, you know, and so it's all this kind of piece of trying to promote everybody joined up thinking and everybody working collaboratively to bring about positive change.
Yeah, thanks for that, because that's a big thing that I talk about a lot, is the disconnected way of thinking and responding to issues. And the fact that really we're spending lots of money but not necessarily spending it the most effectively if we do only look in this tiny tunnel at an issue. I'm familiar with the fact that over the years, the Inspector of Prison and the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture and the UN have raised issues around healthcare and prison healthcare, and saying that prison health is public health. We might just talk about that for a second, because we're obviously in a pandemic situation where there's a global public health crisis, COVID-19, the coronavirus, and prisons are highly combustible, dangerous environments in this regard. Can you describe some of your recent engagement on this issue? And I know it's changing constantly, and states and organizations are trying to respond to the emerging evidence and the emerging best practice. Yeah. But what have you been calling for from IPRT in relation to prisons?
Yeah, so I mean, this is an unbelievably challenging situation for everybody. We've had experience, so IPRT previously has done work in research work in terms of the monitoring of infectious diseases in prisons, and speaking about HIV and TB and Hep C. So there is experience in prisons. You've got a population, a cohort of people that have poorer levels of good health, you know, but, and that's linked to socioeconomic background and issues of addictions and mental health and homelessness. So it's not that we accept that, but we know this to be the case. So, but what we haven't had is the experience of an epidemic or this wide-scale infection happening outside in the community at the same time, and all services coming under pressure at the same time. So it's a hugely challenging situation. And just to say at the outset that compared to our nearest neighbours, in fact, the Republic of Ireland has done pretty well so far. The Department of Justice and the Irish Prison Service took preemptive and protective action early on. In the executive clinical lead has by luck, you know, or maybe by design, has a public health background, so they actually have the in-house expertise, you know, and they've been doing training and planning and contingency planning since early February to late February, working with the Department of Justice. So one of our key calls, our early calls, is to get the numbers down. Frankly, Jane, we are sitting on our hands a lot, wanting to say, told you so, told you so, told you so. Yeah. Not about a pandemic, but all the issues that we constantly talk about, ranging from overcrowding, the need to have single cell accommodation for all who want it, you know, so numbers down, the provision of healthcare. So just in terms, so among our key calls would have been, for example, a prison healthcare review, which ironically has actually been undertaken this year. It was in motion. It is something that the Committee for the Prevention of Torture had asked for many times. Again, that's an example of the policy advocacy piece, is that you are using levers such as international rights mechanisms and using their recommendations to bring about local response. So that was the situation that we were in. I've lost my track slightly because healthcare is so massive at the moment. Another one of our calls until now would have been that prison healthcare should be under the remit of the Department of Health, and that is for a number of reasons, including expertise and professional progression among medical care, but also prison healthcare does not fall under any inspection remit. So HICWA does not inspect healthcare in prison. So there are a lot of these challenges which are actually moot right now, and it has to be recognised that right now everybody is working together towards bringing in the best possible practice. But key to all of this has been overcrowding in prisons and the need to urgently reduce the number of people in prison. This is you know, we've been talking ourselves blue talking about this over many years. So that was one of the first things that we said to the Department of Justice. So what we did was, in terms of policy advocacy, in this circumstances, we decided that really direct engagement is what people need, right? You know, which is likely to be the most effective, recognizing that everybody is under enormous pressure and challenge to both protect the health of people in prison, but also with issues of public safety and other concerns. So our overarching thing is the need to reduce the prison population urgently and safely. And we recognise that the Department of Justice and the Irish Prison Service has reduced the prison population by just under 10%. We think it should go another 10% just to allow the flexibility, because a lot of our prisons are designed for multi-occupancy of cells. So Clover Hill Remand Prison, for example, the majority of cells are three-man cells. In Midlands, you have cells that were designed for 4 people. I mean, physical distancing cannot be achieved in these circumstances right now to the level that is necessary to protect health and lives. So getting the numbers down has been crucial. We are also very concerned about elderly prisoners and prisoners who have particular chronic health conditions, such as respiratory conditions, which make them much more vulnerable to adverse consequences if they contract COVID-19. And we also know that all residential settings, including prisons, are just rife for, if there's a word which is cluster amplification, which and the word rampaging has been used by the UN Commissioner on Human Rights, you know. So, you know, there are huge concerns there that remain for the elderly and people with compromised health. And our view is they need to release more people with urgency.
The numbers went down a few years ago. When I was there, they'd gone very high and were increasing after a number of years, partly due to sort of punitive public policy and rhetoric from politicians. But into the future, do we not need to look at the judiciary's role in this, in the sense that prison's refrain is, we need to take everyone sent to us by the courts? So do judges in the long term need to look really at whether prison is the best option for low-level offenders, non-violent offenders, drug-addicted offenders, female offenders with children? And how do you think we might persuade more of a compassionate understanding and also a public health approach really to the phenomenon of crime? Because lots of criminal activity and addiction is related, at least in my view, and according to a lot of evidence I've seen, to childhood trauma combined with structural injustice and inequality. How can we bring that to the judiciary, Fíona? Big question.
Thanks, Jane. There are so many. I mean, I think when we get through this current pandemic and the crisis, there'll be a lot of questions asked about, if we could safely release so many people from prisons, why were we holding them in prison in the first place? So there will be big questions to ask. And actually, there have been very positive moves in society. For example, an increase in housing available to the homeless and the rough sleepers, you know. And so there have been a lot of, hopefully, long-lasting positive silver linings, let's say, to the current. Well, it's too early to talk about silver linings where people's lives are still at risk, but you know, we just need to acknowledge that when society needed to move, it has, you know, and we hope those learnings won't be lost afterwards. To go back to sentencing, there are a few different things here. First of all, we don't know what the situation is because of the lack of access to published sentencing data. So before we start before we start drilling down into who's responsible for the high numbers of people in prison, we absolutely need more rigorous sentencing data that is made available to public scrutiny. Now, it's more hopeful now because since the passing of the Judicial Council Act, and within that act there's provision for a Sentencing Information Committee, Sentencing Information Guidelines Committee, I think is the official name. That, I believe, should be established by June or whatever, within 12 months of the act being signed into law. So that will come up this summer. And that should certainly enable us to have better sight of what is happening in the courts. So before I get into the punitive thing, so then you do ask questions. Why in last year, why on average is there 25 to 30% of women in prison under sentence are serving sentences of less than 12 months? Mm-hmm. You know, it looks on the surface to be overly punitive by the courts. Mm-hmm. However, we also are not clear, we don't have enough sight of what the alternatives that are available are. Mm-hmm. Are they functioning effectively? So certainly there's another piece that we need to have Department of Justice led deep review into the provision of community service, for example, nationwide. Mm-hmm. We need to know, so for example, since 2011, judges in the it applies mostly to the district courts, they're obliged to consider community service in lieu of sentences of less than 12 months. Mm-hmm. What we don't know is the nature of the probation assessments of suitability for community service, you know. So definitely it's back to the research and evidence, you know. What are we responding to here, right? We don't know. So for example, IPRT undertook research. So the now Dr. Kate O'Hara undertook research comparing short-term prison sentences with community service, and she did find that her research found huge variation in what was handed down by courts around the country. But there was but we don't know enough about why that is. So for example, in border counties, you found that the courts were more likely to give out, to hand down community service than in other counties. And is that because of the high use of community service orders on the other side of the border? Possibly. We don't know if, for example, the availability of gender-specific community service options include in very rural areas. So all of this needs to inform. We need to understand better on what basis judges are making those decisions before we are sure that they're being overly punitive, you know, particularly in relation to women in prison. I mean, I've said it so many times, there is no worse indictment on our society that some women see prison as a place of respite. It is where they are safest, it's where they're out of harm's way, you know. Nobody should have to go to prison to access the services or the safe housing or the safety that they need. Prison is a terrible place. It should be a sanction of last resort, and we have to invest in community alternatives. What we've left sight of is what is available for women in particular, but also men who are you know.
On that, I have witnessed when I was doing bail research for IPRT, some judges sentence people, or well, not sentence actually because it was bail, but put people on remand for their own well-being. You could tell the language they were using was, you're sick and unwell, you've some mental health problems that no one know what quite it is, you're homeless, or you're after relapsing into addiction, go into prison for a few weeks and you'll get the health care that you're not getting in the community. And you're right, it is a damning indictment, but it wasn't motivated by punitiveness or even to protect the public. It was about the poor, vulnerable person and the judge not really knowing what else to do, you know. So you're right, more data to just explain, to bring this all to light.
Absolutely, you know, but not to let anybody off the hook either, you know, it just points at the urgent need for joined up cross-departmental thinking. We saw published reports in the last year, although the deaths didn't happen. So there were 3 deaths in prison that happened over maybe a period of 18 months where people, so 2 men and a woman, took their own lives or self-harmed within a very short period of being committed to prison. In at least 2 of the cases, all 3 had no previous experience of prison. In 2 cases, they had no previous convictions. We don't know that about the 3rd person. In all 3 cases, 2 of the 3 cases, there was previous strong engagement with psychological supports, including spending time in a psychiatric hospital previously. And how these people ended up in the prison system and then took their own lives, because prison is it is not a therapeutic environment. It is terrifying, and particularly the very early stages. So what we had was 3 people detained on remand for less serious offences who took their own lives within a very short time. So a few hours, a few days, and I think it was 10 days was the last one. They should not have been in prison at all. They should have been cared for in more appropriate facilities.
And of course, that must be extremely distressing for prison staff as well, who are ordinary men and women who don't have training in this and who are having to maybe cut people down or just deal with dead human beings with no real skill sets or supports to help buffer them in that. So the secondary trauma around having to care for people when you don't know how to care for them must be very challenging. Yeah. I know as well that mental health and the prevalence of people with mental illness in the prison system is something that IPRT has brought to public attention many times. Isn't that right, Fee?
Yeah, and again, in different ways. So just going back to the policy advocacy piece, in this we try to engage, with, working in coalition, for example, with Mental Health Reform, which is an organisation similar in size and approach to IPRT, but working in the area of mental health. And we also try to get it on the agenda of the Department of Health. So there's that kind of nexus that, just to say, and our engagement with international monitoring mechanisms is also really crucial in that regard. So, I mean, what we have in Ireland, although the research is not recent, but the prevalence of mental health difficulties among men in prison ranges from I can't remember the baseline, but up to 27%, and for women it's up to 60%. So that's very high, and that's not including addictions, which is another issue that needs to be spoken about. Estimated at up to 85% of women in prison, and up to around region of 70% of men in prison. So these are the issues at any time. The former Director General of the Irish Prison Service put on record that more than 300 people in prison have serious mental health difficulties, and we know at any time between 20 and 30 people in prison have been assessed as in need of urgent transfer to the Central Mental Hospital. Some of those people they are transferred within a number of days, but we also know that people have been held for, so the average is over 100 days on the waiting list in prison, which is an inappropriate environment. We know of people who who have waited 504 days for transfer, and we understand that other people have been held even more than 2 years. So they are not receiving the care that they need in an appropriate therapeutic environment. And at the same time, as you said, Jane, that prison officers have been required to care for these people, and that is not they are not psychiatric nurses. This is not their specific role description, but just to acknowledge that particularly in Clover Hill, that the care that officers do provide to people who have mental health issues is above and beyond in many cases, so it does need to be acknowledged. Yes. But they shouldn't have to deal with it.
I was in Barlinnie prison as part of my PhD research last year, and I was brought to the mental health unit where it was largely older prison officers working there, and they were remarkable. Like the kindness, the care, the relational skills that they had, and they were very sensitive to mood changes. They were just really on the lookout. But as you say, they're just not trained, and the environment was still a prison. It looked like Mountjoy prison. It was not cozy or soothing or anything that might be appropriate to people with serious mental health challenges?
Well, it's interesting because, Jane, I know you know a lot about trauma-informed care and approaches, and it did strike me listening to experts in that area, how they talk about the importance of individual agency and autonomy of the person who has experienced a trauma, and whether that could ever be provided in a prison environment. Choice, agency, autonomy are the things that are taken away from you immediately you enter a prison system, more or less.
Yeah.
So there are very basic questions there, for sure.
And Fíona, you adverted there a couple of times to the usefulness of engaging with international treaty monitoring bodies. I myself have experienced the excitement and kind of thrill and seeing that stuff could happen at the UN with the Committee Against Torture, and you yourself were there. You've engaged with the UN Committee on Women and other committees, and engaged with the CPT. Why do you think that's worth doing?
It has proven, so we've demonstrated through our work, we have actually used those mechanisms so successfully as a lever, partly because Ireland likes to think of itself as a human rights, if not leader, but leader, for a small country, Ireland as a country likes to pride itself in that way. Ireland doesn't particularly want to be embarrassed for human rights breaches on the international stage. I think Ireland likes to consider our human rights as among our part of our identity, even though we know we fare pretty poorly at home in different ways. So I'll talk about two different mechanisms, maybe the UN Committee Against Torture and Convention Against Torture, and the Council of Europe, European Committee for the Prevention of Torture. So to start with the second one first, the Committee for the Prevention of Torture visits Ireland approximately every 4 years, and it has a remit of inspecting, so it makes visits to places of detention. Those include prisons, children detention centres, psychiatric institutions, and Garda cells. Not yet direct provision centres, but maybe that will happen in the future. What's really important, so we have opportunities to engage with the committee before they arrive in terms of flagging issues that we believe they should pay attention to. But there are really important and rigorous monitoring mechanism, and that they would never take what we say, they would verify whatever it is. So following their visits, so they spend approximately 2 weeks in Ireland in going directly into all of these institutions. And it has to be acknowledged that the Irish state actually complies and facilitates their visits, because other jurisdictions do not, they are not so welcome. So we should actually, I think it's really important to underline how much the Irish state does engage with these monitoring mechanisms, which on a level are, openly. Well, I'm sure they put positive spin. I mean, we don't oversell it, but they certainly engage with them, and that is hugely important. So following their visit, the Committee for the Prevention of Torture within 6 months issues its report. It has initial findings, but then its report that submits to government, and then the government has 6 months to give its response back, and then these are published, And what we have found over many years is that this has been like a critical external view on what is happening behind closed doors in Ireland. The recommendations are extremely useful. They're made by experts, that are looking at right standards, but also best practice, and they're very solution focused as well. There are actual recommendations that can be implemented. However, we would also say that actually civil society organizations have an enormously important role to play here, and that we amplify the findings and recommendations, So for example, in 2011, most usefully, the CPT's most recent inspection report was published in the run-up to a general election. So this is going back into the advocacy and levers piece. I can even tell you, I think it was the 10th of February.
Oh, wow.
And the election was about the 24th or the 27th, because the Ombudsman for Children, quite strategically, published a report on the experience of children in St. Patrick's Institution on the day after.
Okay.
Yeah, the two came together. It was a good week.
Yeah.
But what our role, so IPRT, for both of those, but particularly the CPT, is that we made a media storm out of it, so we issued press releases. The then Executive Director, Liam Herrick, engaged in multiple media appearances across, raising awareness in Ireland of the worst human rights abuses happening in our prisons. And it's done in our name, so everyone who pays taxes in Ireland, this is done in your name. And people who don't pay taxes in Ireland, yes. But it's done in the name of the people of Ireland. It was critical. So at that time, we had around 1,000 men were still slopping out in prisons. We had, upwards of around 200 locked up in solitary confinement every day. Aside from the grave human rights abuse of detaining children in the adult prison system, children in the prison system did not have access to the complaints remit of the Ombudsman for Children, and so on, So just to say that it would suit probably the government for that report to just be published quietly on a website, and the CPT does issue a press release, but civil society and advocacy organisations have an enormous role to bring of raising attention to the fact that this has been published and what it is saying about Ireland, both good and bad. At that time, it was pretty much all bad. It was all bad. But we do have to recognise that there's been, transformative changes since then. In that case, the timing was particularly useful because we had, it was a swing election, so it was transformative. So the government that came into power following that election had a majority, and then the work we'd done amplifying the issues, as well as the direct engagement by our organisation with what were opposition parties, but we're now in government, influenced positively the programme for government, which was step one, So for example, in the programme for government, it committed to ending the imprisonment of children in St. Patrick's Institution. However, getting it into the programme for government is step one. Step two is ensuring that it actually happens. Yes. And that's where the second mechanism, which was the UN Convention Against Torture. So Ireland had its, Jane, you'd be able to correct me, is that our first? Was that our second periodic review?
No, our first one was
in 2011. Yeah. So our first periodic review under the UN Convention Against Torture, which I believe you represented IPRT at that in Geneva. So we brought the issues to the UN committee again, and the same. I'm just picking the headline ones of slopping out and children in St. Patrick's Institution. So we got more recommendations. There was a very interesting thing happened at that particular hearing, which was that the Irish state, in a way, let's say, expressed its disagreement with the findings of the Ombudsman for Children's research on children in St. Pat's. I don't know if you remember that. And it was
filmed. It was webcast.
It was pretty dismissive and misguided, it has to be said. And helpfully, that brought to wider public attention just exactly the treatment of children in St. Patrick's Institution, and just to recognise the enormous role that the Ombudsman for Children played in that. But then again, IPRT had engaged with the Ombudsman for Children, ensuring that children in St. Pat's were on its, so you have all the competing issues. How do you ensure that the group that you're most concerned about, which in our case was children in detention, well, children in adult prison, how do you get that onto the agenda of, issues facing all children in Ireland? But still, in November that year, in a parliamentary question, the then Minister for Justice, Alan Shatter, said that finances weren't available to bring to an end the detention of children in the adult prison system. So this is where we move to the next stage, which is using the media and working with, in fact, what's the name is going? 6-1 News. Was the American, oh my goodness, Katrina Perry? Thank you. Working with Katrina Perry and, you know, assisting with facilitating interviews and that, she ran a piece, and it was on the 1st or 2nd of January 2012. We had a brand new, the first Minister for Children and Youth Affairs, which was Frances Fitzgerald TD, in office about 2 days, or in that particular role for 2 days. And an item ran on 6-1 News focusing specifically on the detention or the imprisonment of children in the adult prison system, and specifically in St. Patrick's Institution. And arising from that, the media coverage of that ran for about 2 weeks. You know, it was just a massive news story. A lot of radio channels picked up. It made its way into print media, and then other organisations, including IPRT, but also the Children's Rights Alliance, you know, came out with statements and that. And this all strengthened the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs' arguments for the resources to build in Oberstown in order to bring to an end the imprisonment of children in the adult prison system. It took a further, so it finally, St. Patrick's Institution closed 2017. It was about April 2017 when it finally closed. But there was another step in between, which was, again, just looking at advocacy and levers and amplification. The Inspector of Prisons, I think it was the end of, I might be getting my years wrong, but I think it was 2013.
His report, was it?
Yeah, a report on St. Patrick's Institution. And that again was critical. But again, you know, the Inspector of Prisons still so submits reports to the Minister for Justice, who decides when those reports are going to be, when and how those reports are going to be published. Now, the Minister also has the power to redact. In my experience, that's only been done once in relation to a special investigation, certainly in the last 11 years. But the Inspector of Prisons can publish a report on their website and nobody pays attention to it. This can happen, and this is again where civil society and community partners play a role in amplifying it. So again, we raised a lot of awareness among members of the Oireachtas, in the media, with other relevant statutory bodies and oversight about the findings in that report. And it's still worth reading that report again, because actually there are 3 particular cases of young guys behind the cell, and the fear, and how the inspectorate describes the fear and isolation and vulnerability of those children in those cells. Really.
Just on the role of the Inspector of Prisons, because you rightly mentioned there the fact that the Minister for Justice you know, still has control really over the publication, or I think you did, the publication of inspection reports, and due to poor resourcing of the Office of the Inspector of Prisons, no inspections have even taken place for several years. How damaging is that to the office, and to really being compliant, not only compliant with our human rights standards, because Michael Donlan, the former DG, put it on record that they want to be a world-class prison system where human rights are cherished. How can we do that when we don't know what's going on there, when an inspector can't conduct inspections?
Yeah, so to go back to, as it stands, the most recent inspection report of a closed prison in Ireland is in fact the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture report, published November 2015, but the visit was undertaken in 2014, and that is hugely problematic. There's been one inspection report since then, published in May 2017 on the training unit semi-open prison, which was closed. So anyway, so it's hugely problematic. There's been, I mean, we had the sad passing of the former Inspector of Prisons, and of course there was a period where we had no Inspector of Prisons, and now the current Inspector of Prisons, Patricia Gilheany, was appointed in 2018. My year's right. It's one big long penal reform year, Jane. Hard to split them up. And we have been very concerned. So what we have seen from 2012 on, the Inspector of Prisons remit group, initially a very important function, which is undertaking independent investigations into deaths occurring in prison custody, and also shortly on temporary release, shortly after release. Hugely important, but the resources, in our view, did not follow that increase in remit. And in fact, it should be acknowledged that there's a backlog now, but throughout, so there was a lack of inspection reports, but deaths in custody reports were continuously published, and that should be acknowledged. But they became, in effect, our only insight really into what was happening on the ground. Hugely important, very fair reports that identify systemic issues, you know, towards preventing potential future death. Incredibly important. But we're mindful that the equivalent office in Northern Ireland, which is the Northern Ireland Prisoner Ombudsman, undertakes. It's not the equivalent office, but the body that undertakes these investigations in Northern Ireland has 2 or 3 times the staff that the inspectorate has here, and the prison population of region of 1,500, whereas we have 3,500 to 4,000. You know, so there is no comparison in resources available. So we've been very concerned. A further remit that was added, which was independent oversight of prisoner complaints. Now, there are 2 things. This was additional. Again, the resources weren't following the increase of remit that was being given to the Office of the Inspector of Prisons. But in fact, that effectively really hasn't happened as it should. But anyway, that's another conversation about complaints. So without question, what we have seen is that the resources haven't followed the increasing remit of the Office of Inspector of Prisons. We are highly concerned that without inspection reports being published and subject to public scrutiny, we don't know what's happening behind prison walls. When we were engaging recently with the Committee for the Prevention of Torture, so just to compare, back in when we were engaging with them back in 2014, a lot of our information drew on published prison inspection reports. There had been none in the interim, and a lot of the information IPRT, as a civil society NGO, had generated through requesting information from the prison service, which they provided to us, and also going back to the parliamentary questions, the information that's on the record, you know. Now, IPRT is not a monitoring mechanism. This is not our remit, you know. So what we are campaigning for quite clearly is that that monitoring, so different mechanisms are adequately resourced, have adequate independence, you know, and our job should be to amplify what they publish. Their job is actually the detailed inspection and oversight. Yeah, so it's a big concern.
It is. On that, and I've taken lots of your time, so I'll wrap up now in a second, but I know that a major campaigning issue for IPRT for several years now has been ratification of the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. And that is relevant to inspection and human rights protection. It's prevention focused. Is that still a priority? You know, once things settle down with the pandemic, is that a major ask for IPRT still? And for other civil society bodies, because it's also relevant to old folks' homes, nursing homes, congregated settings, the airport, holding centres, direct provision, yada, yada, yada.
Absolutely.
It needs to be done, doesn't it?
Can I just say, when it's ratified, you and me, Jane, we're going out for a beer. We will deserve it. Because we have, like, in our different areas, have kept attention on this over a long time. We will deserve it. Yeah, I mean, I think the current pandemic has just shown how important the guidance and the cross-disciplinary approach of a national preventive mechanism, how important it would be. In our work at the moment, we've been watching really closely what the UK NPM has been publishing. And we noticed, for example, the Scottish Human Rights Commission drawing on, you know, the sort of the guidance issued by the national preventative mechanism, particularly in terms of releasing people from prison, but also facilitating family and everything. So it's that overarching guidance that recognizes that these are people in different settings who are all deprived of their liberty, and by virtue of being deprived of their liberty are more vulnerable, you know, to ill treatment, potential torture and human rights abuses. So I think the pandemic has underlined just the importance of these overarching monitoring mechanisms. So we have not shifted in that. And in fact, so both the Irish Council for Civil Liberties made the ratification of OPCAT one of its key asks in the general election campaign just now, as did IPRT. So it was one of our 5 key recommendations. So what we would absolutely want to see is commitment to ratification of the OPCAT in the next programme for government. My understanding from ICCL is that all parties in the run-up to the election certainly certainly subscribed to that and said they would. Two, the Green Party and the Social Democrats, I think, both of them actually included in their party manifestos ratification of OPCAT. And we know with Sinn Féin, certainly other parties have certainly spoken about it previously. Where it's at now, I mean, in a way, I think it's true. It is probably fair to say that it was being seen by the state as a justice issue, and they just realised quite late on that no, in fact, this applies to people in other settings as well. And that is certainly a challenge, but it's one that has to be overcome. We're also, I think, what is really helpful is that, you know, you don't just ratify APCAT and then it's done. It's something that's continuously evolving. And it's important that the state doesn't feel that it needs to have everything answered in the first place, because one of the roles of the NPM is to identify gaps and fill them as it goes on, you know. So what we would really want...
Progressive realization, yeah.
Love it. But we just say ratify OPCAT, start the clock, have a national preventive mechanism in place, and then you have a process of improvement and prevention that continues into the future. Now, also to say that I think it was the end of 2018, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission expressed an interest in taking on a role as a coordinating body. So we welcome that. We would welcome maybe more engagement by justice, by other departments, and certainly at this point now, I suppose from a prisons perspective, we want to see it ratified. We think the blocks are more likely, or the no, I'm not too sure actually, really. You know, so there are gaps within the justice system that need to be addressed, but also there's the broader piece of how multidisciplinary expertise can be brought across all places where people can be deprived of their settings towards preventing ill treatment of everyone, wherever they may be.
Well said. Last question, Fíona. When the pandemic abates and there's some ability to think about other things, you know, and to return to policy in a more, I suppose, measured way, not reacting to a crisis situation, what would you like to see happen in the criminal justice context in the penal setting going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of different areas, nobody wants to go back to where we were, you know, and that's not only in terms of the penal system. We did see a lot of progressive reforms between 2011 and 2016, let's say, in the penal system. And we were disappointed in 2018, 2019 to see a lot of these, some progress maintained, but some of it reversed. You know, at the most simple level, if you can release 10% of the prison population safely into the community, particularly in these terrible circumstances, then why were they there in the first place, you know? IPRT, we have a project called Progress in the Penal System. A number of the actions being undertaken now are things that we have been calling for in a very kind of strategic, but very clear and transparent way over recent years. So what we would like to see is a return. So another example, Jane, is that, you know, in our report in 2018, we underlined the need for access to e-learning, cloud-based learning, electronic learning for people who are in prison. And now what we have are prison teachers going above and beyond to get materials into the prisons, but how much easier it would have been, you know, if electronic learning, if that system was already in place. So I think there's going to be a lot of learnings arising from the current crisis, you know, and hopefully those lessons learned will inform how we go forward in terms of prison conditions, in terms of single cell accommodation for everyone, including just prison as a last resort. So we're hopeful, you know, but I don't think anybody wants to go back just to where we were before.
I have here the Whitaker report, which if the politicians and policymakers had listened to this back in 1985, unfortunately poor IPRT has had to repeat many of the calls for single cell occupancy, imprisonment as a last resort, you know, personal sentence plans and a focus on developing the individual and, you know, having a strong community sanctioned system that's effective and has respect from the judiciary and the public. Fee, you are a legend. I'm using this word
We are legends.
yeah, at the moment because you do such immense good work with good humour and reach across the aisles and build relationships, and no one does media and stats like you do. So thank you so much for the work you do and for sharing your insights with me today.
Jane, all the work that IPRT achieves was a team effort, both within the IPR team and including people like yourself that have come before and after. And I suppose on a basic level that once we have a chance to explain where we're coming from, people understand, you know, people generally understand. So thank you.
Thanks. And the interns are amazing. You know, the work, I would just say for anyone that is a small organization or even individuals, they should look to IPRT to see what can be achieved, you know, with collaboration and being creative and, you know, looking for opportunities to influence. How to talk policy and influence people. Thank you very much, Fee, for everything. Take care.
Thank you, Jay.